I don't know if you gathered this, but in my last few lectures, I had described the American economy, and it's doing very well throughout most of the 1920s. I had been talking about the Coolidge administration. Calvin Coolidge is going to be elected in 1924, and for 4 years, he really embraces this laissez-faire approach to governing the economy, similar to that late 19th century era. Backs away from regulation, embraces the idea that the best thing that government can do when it comes to American business is stay out of American business. And he does. And I said that there are short term benefits. From 24 until 1928, you do see significant growth in the American economy. But 1929, as you're going to find out here today, that is really going to come to a crashing halt and it's going to produce what we call the Great Depression. What I want to do with this lecture is kind of describe to you what went wrong, so to speak, and what produced the Great Depression. If you're looking for the definition of successful capitalism in the 1920s, look no further than the New York Stock Exchange. In the aftermath of World War I, New York had replaced London and Paris as the financial capital of the world, and the stock market is doing very, very well in the 1920s. As a matter of fact, for the first time in American history, regular, ordinary Americans, people like me and you, we're not talking about investment bankers, ordinary Americans are putting every last dime that they have to their name, they're putting that in the stock market because the thought is the market is doing so phenomenally well. It's not a matter of if you get rich, it's a matter of when you get rich. How rich will you get? It's not even so much that as much as it is there are all kinds of, shall we say, inventive, creative ideas that have been deregulated on Wall Street, and it allows people to do things that were not all exactly on the up and up just a few years earlier. One of these practices that is ultimately going to lead to some trouble is the idea of borrowing money and then taking that money, putting it into the stock market. Okay. Now, that's all fine and well because the thought at the time was you're going to make that money back. You'll be able to pay off your creditors because, again, it's not a matter of if, but when. But if the market doesn't do what you need it to do, not only are you on the hook for that loan, you have no way of paying it back, right? We're talking about record-breaking blue chip stocks going crazy in the 1920s, and then everything is really going to come to a screeching halt the last few weeks of October 1929. In or on October 26, 1929, what comes to be known as Black Thursday, there is a selling spree. And part of the reason why is that some of those loans that people had taken out and put in the stock market, they get called, right? You owe us that money and you owe us yesterday. Well, think about this for a second. If you don't have that liquid cash on hand to pay back the loan, and you don't want to get into things like selling your home or selling your car or selling a kidney, right? Then the only thing that you have that you can sell that might get a return would be the stock, right? Now, this wouldn't be that big of a problem if everybody was not doing it all at the same time. In a way, what's going on in October 1929 is not really that much different than what's going on in October 2008 when the housing market crashed. You have a massive amount of supply all at the same time and is bringing down the price or the demand. Now, what happens in Black Thursday is the financial house of Morgan, JP Morgan and his associates. They come in, and what they do is they try to save the day. They try to form these buying pools. What they're trying to do is to put a bottom floor on the market and restore consumer confidence so that by Friday, hopefully just get to the weekend, when the bells open on Monday, it'll be business as usual. And there for a little bit, it looks like they're going to succeed. We make it into the weekend, October 1929. We make it past Monday, but then on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, a day that would live in infamy, come to be known as Black Tuesday, the sell-off begins to happen once again, right? Only this time, the Morgans and the other investment giants of the world, there's really nothing that they can do. They sit back on the sidelines and they watch helplessly as America sinks into what comes to be known as the Great Depression, the single worst economic disaster in modern world history, possibly ever in human history, depending on how exactly you want to define this, right? If you were to ask an average ordinary citizen what caused the Great Depression, 9 times out of 10, you're going to hear the crashing of the stock market. And they're right. The problem is, it's just not the entirety of the truth. The entirety of the truth is you've got a lot of different things that are crashing down on the American economy, and they're all coming down at the same time. Let me explain. Part of the problem with the stock market is the institution that is now referred to as speculation, okay? Whether we're talking about stocks or gasoline prices, what you do is you pay somebody to speculate, to make an educated guess as to what's going to happen to the price of the stock or the price of crude oil or whatever it is, right? Now, today there are reforms and rules that have been placed into effect that essentially prevent what we would probably call a conflict of interest. In the 1920s, you don't have that regulation. You have individuals that essentially work for stock companies that are also being employed as a speculator. So think about this. If you stand to gain if Kodak's stock goes sky high, why would you not speculate that the sky is the limit for Kodak? Of course, you need to pour every dime in. Bet the farm on Kodak. It's only going to get much, 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 much better. There's a clear conflict of interest, and there's nothing that's really preventing these people that stand to gain from speculating, not necessarily putting their best guess forward, but their best interest forward. There's nothing preventing that from happening. The other problem that we have in the 1920s, and I mentioned this in the last lecture, we're now fully in the middle of a consumer based economy, which means that the economy functions just great as long as me, you, us, we go out and we spend money. If we don't spend money, the economy begins to falter. And the truth be known, the economy had begun to sputter as early as 1926. Demand began to slacken a little bit, and when it did, it signaled to the Henry Fords and the J.P. Morgans of the world to slacken production. And the way that you do that is you begin to lay people off. You don't work them as much as you used to work them. And just like me and you, when we don't get paid what we're used to being paid, we stop spending, right? And so, what we think happened in the Great Depression was that wealth that was created, make no mistake about it, it was real. But that wealth that was created in the 1920s was stubbornly stuck at the top end of that economy. Had there been a little bit more of an equal distribution of the wealth, combined with the tighter regulation of what was going on at Wall Street, there's a good chance that we could have lessened the effect of the Great Depression. International finance is a part of this as well. I told you in the last one of the last lectures that what's going to happen in the 1920s is our export market, in particular our European export market, is going to dry up. Germany begins to default on those loans. When that happens, they stop paying back the French. When the French don't have the money to pay back the Americans, our export market dries up. Buying on margin, that's what you and I would call buying with credit. If you think about it, what credit really is a promise. That's really what you're doing when you slap down some plastic or you sign a loan. You're saying, I promise I will pay this back. I will do so on the terms and conditions that you're loaning me this money. When banks don't get that money back that they were anticipating, what doesn't happen is they don't make more loans. They don't make any more loans to you because clearly you're a risk. But at the same time, they stop making loans all across the board. Banks are a really important institution. We don't have time to really dig into this, but as you probably can infer, When banks stop making loans, that's going to constrict the American economy and it's going to slacken demand. But worst of all are failing banks. Um, there are banks that are failing at a pretty alarming level in the 1920s. And there are rumors that banks are about to fail. Now, if you hear that the bank that you've been banking with for the last 15 years is about to go belly up, it's about to go under, every last dime that you've ever deposited in that bank, that, that's going to go down with it. And so there would be these wild rumors that the bank is running out of money, and people would literally make a run on the bank and they would take out every single dime that was in their account to protect it. You can understand where they were coming from, but this is what's killing the banks. People are taking out all of their deposits, and as a consequence, it's killing the banks. I mean, if there's one thing that is really, edging the American economy on the brink of disaster, we're about ready to go over the cliff, it's the failures of these banks, right? You'll see what I mean once we get to our next lecture. But for right now, I'm hopeful that you can understand that the causation of the Great Depression is multi-layered, it's multifaceted, there's a lot of different wrinkles, and they're all happening at the same time. What gets lost in all these facts and figures would be the human cost of the Great Depression. Um, when people get laid off, it's constricting demand. Demand gets smaller for reasons that I've already talked about. But I want to give you a quick scenario, very fast, to give you some perspective of exactly what's going on. Um, the University of Texas, where they play football, or Texas A&M is another very good example. It holds about 100,000 people, and I want you to imagine that that stadium is letting out after a football game on Saturday afternoon. And on the way out, each one of these individuals is handed a pink slip, and they're unemployed, right? That's what's happening on a weekly basis. Now, I want you to imagine that happening week after week after week after week. Imagine what that's going to do when it comes to the American economy. There's a guy that works at Stanford, a guy by the name of David Kennedy, that makes a case just like this. And it does give you a very good understanding of the magnitude of the Great Depression. But when the pink slips came, when the layoffs settled in, there's an eerie level of quiet. People are blaming themselves, right? There's this level of inadequacy. So there's something wrong with me. I can't provide for my family. There's something wrong with me. And then we begin to look outward for individuals to blame. One of the groups that we blame would be foreign born Americans. In particular, we're going to begin to blame people of Mexican ancestry. Okay. These are individuals that had come to the United States in the midst of the 1920s when the times were great, and they had more or less been invited to come. Um, we need a workforce, and so in any case, many of these individuals never became card-carrying U.S. citizens. Some of them did, many of them didn't. And the thought was if you could just get these immigrants to go back to wherever it was that they came from, we would open up so many jobs for real Americans, quote unquote, real Americans. But this is not the root of the problem. Keep in mind that the economy was great when they were brought to the United States, and they didn't cause the Great Depression any more than anybody else did. But what you will see in places like Los Angeles, places like Detroit, you'll see this vicious deportation campaign, right? This campaign to round up immigrants, sometimes using violent methods, and ship them to the Mexican-Texas border and basically just dump them and pretty much say, we'll see you later. There begins to be attacks on the president. The way that it works in the American economy, for good, better, or worse, is the president gets blamed if the economy goes south. And the guy that's in the presidency at the time is Herbert Hoover. We've talked about him before. We'll talk about him again. But Herbert Hoover, in addition to embracing some of the philosophies of his predecessors, laissez-faire economics, he had this very introverted personality. And that introverted personality really kind of came across as I don't care, it doesn't matter to me. And so what you're seeing all across the United States are these massive shanty towns, these homeless encampments that are popping up, and people begin calling them Hoovervilles, right? They were naming these homeless encampments after the President of the United States because he came across as so callous and uncaring, right? We'll talk a little bit more about Hoover here in just a second. But there's one thing that I want you to understand. The response is not going to come from Washington for reasons that I've already discussed. Herbert Hoover has a philosophy that I can't intervene directly, even if it means easing some of the pain of the American people. You have to understand that from a local, even a state level, nobody had really anticipated something like the Great Depression happening. So city governments are ill-equipped to take care of the suffering of the American people. Unions don't have people paying dues anymore because nobody's working. They can't help. Some of these mutual aid societies, like the Society for the Protection of Italian Immigrants, they're not taking in the same kind of money that they once upon a time were. They're not able to respond. My point in telling you all of this is that any kind of meaningful action, any kind of meaningful response is going to come from the community level. It's going to come from activists on a local grassroots level demanding some sort of action to transition the American economy out of these difficult times. Now, we have talked about the American Communist Party in this class before. And I had told you that its stated goal, especially in 1919, was to bring communism to American shores. That was its whole purpose, to overthrow the U.S. government by violent means if necessary, right? That is still its stated goal upon the onslaught of the Great Depression, but things begin to change. And the unique aspect of the Communist Party's activity in the early and mid 1930s is it does take a turn to the local level. Let me give you a couple different examples. One, Alabama, 1932. There's a collection of African American boys that are riding this railroad, this train, right? They were hoboing, so to speak. Now, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. People of all races, all backgrounds did this. What they're looking for are jobs. And the idea was there's greener pastures down the road. On this one particular occasion, they're on this train car with two white girls. And when the train stops, these two girls run to the sheriff's department and they report that they were raped by these 9 African American boys. Now, it is the 30s, and we are talking about Alabama here. We're talking about a time period where that you needed had a lot less than that would find you lynched, right? The fact that it ever made it to trial in the first place, that's an accomplishment in and of itself, but it's almost a foregone conclusion that these individuals are going to be found guilty. It's the Communist Party that sends its legal resources, something it calls the International Labor Defender, sends it to Scottsboro, Alabama, this scene of the crime, and these lawyers ultimately get the trial to end in a hung jury. Now, I realize that that's essentially a draw, but we're talking about Alabama in the 1930s. That's a really huge accomplishment. And from the perspective of racial and ethnic minorities, that kind of comes across as the Communist Party kind of gets it when it comes to civil rights or a lack thereof. The Communist Party was the only predominantly white organization in American life at that time that's even going through the motions when it comes to civil rights and acknowledging the institution that you and I call Jim Crow. This is going to gain the communists a little bit of level of legitimacy in American life. its involvement within the community is also going to gain it some respect. It's the Communist Party that is really leading some of these rallies, these marches, these demonstrations to bring about change and some sort of reproach to the Great Depression. We see this in Detroit in March 1932. A group calling themselves the Unemployed Councils, of which much of which was made up by members that were card-carrying activists within the Communist Party, some of whom were not. But the Unemployed Councils organize this rally that comes to be known as the Ford Hunger March. Now, it's important that you understand that when these marchers march, they're not marching on Washington, they're not marching on Lansing, Michigan, the state capital. They're marching on the Ford Motor Company. In other words, they're directing their discontent not at Washington, but at the policies of Henry Ford. I need you to understand that Henry Ford was the symbol of successful laissez-faire capitalism throughout much of the 1920s. And the thought was, if we just followed Ford's lead, I mean, this was what we had been promised under Harding, under Coolidge, and now under Hoover. If we just let businessmen conduct their business, they would produce this rising tide in the economy. And of course, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Well, here we are in the depths of the Great Depression. It's 1932. It doesn't get much worse than this. And Henry Ford doesn't seem to have an answer. People are getting a little bit antsy. Now, what these workers wanted to do was march to the Ford headquarters and hand deliver Henry Ford a list of demands, one of which was jobs. We want jobs. We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for work, right? It wasn't long after the march started that the marchers were attacked. First by the Dearborn police force, which Henry Ford held a lot of sway, if you understand what I'm saying, and secondly by Ford's own private police force. It was known as the Service Department, and they were attacked in a very violent manner. As a matter of fact, 4 marchers would actually die in what comes to be known as the Ford Hunger March. In the aftermath of the march, what this is going to do is it's going to destroy Henry Ford's favorable reputation. I mean, nobody enjoyed more publicity in a good way than Henry Ford when it comes to, the merits of laissez-faire capitalism. And now here we are, he not only did not have an answer, but he's actually attacking those people that dared to ask for jobs. So Ford's credibility being absolutely erased, that is going to be very meaningful because ultimately what it's going to do from 1932 really until the late 50s, early 1960s is it's going to banish the business community to the political wilderness. Keep in mind, the business community was more or less calling the shots from the election of U.S. Grant really until right now, 1928, 1929, right? There's another event that I want you to understand, and this really wasn't organized by communists or even radicals. It was organized by World War I veterans. And these veterans organized what came to be known as the Bonus March. Let me explain. Upon their enlistment in the war, 1917, they were promised a bonus for enlisting. And that bonus was due to be paid out in 1945. And what the bonus army begins to do is assemble all of these guys that are World War I veterans and march them to Washington, hence the bonus march. And what they want is an early payment on that bonus. They want their bonus now in 1932. They couldn't wait. They needed the money. They had lost everything. They had sold everything. They didn't have any more answers. They got to Washington, made their demand to President Herbert Hoover, who told them, no, I'm sorry, it's not due until 1945, and you're just going to have to wait. Now, you can say what you want about Herbert Hoover, but a deal is a deal, and a contract is a contract, and it says right there in black and white, 1945, right? In any case, Hoover says no. But what he does next is going to become almost political suicide. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur to shoo these veterans out of Washington. By this point in time, they had set up a sort of a tent camp sort of organization. And they said, we're not leaving until you give us our bonus. And so when they didn't go voluntarily, Hoover called out Douglas MacArthur to assist the Washington, D.C. police force to disperse the bonus marchers. And for reasons that have never really been made clear, Douglas entirely exceeded his orders. And not only did he evict these marchers in the most violent of ways, he put their camp to torch. Now, you would think that you would have to understand that these guys are ex military and they're really going to resent the idea of military force used against veterans, people that were once upon a time in the Army, in the Navy, in their own right, right? And so Hoover never really took Douglas MacArthur to task for this. He doesn't fire him, he doesn't even demote him. As a matter of fact, he doesn't really even give him a public scorn, public talking to. And by not doing this, it added more fuel to the fire that kind of painted Hoover as this uncaring, calloused, really hardened politician that really simply did not understand the true suffering of the American people. And it's going to be that is really going to be the final straw that will pretty much seal the fate of Herbert Hoover and pave the way to Washington for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As a matter of fact, when he was reading about the bonus march and the aftermath, and when Douglas had put the camp to torch, FDR turned to one of his most trusted aides and said, "Well, this elects me, and you'll see what I'm talking about the next time we meet."